I'm the only one who came back. That's not something I ever thought I'd say, and it's not something I've said out loud until now. I've told versions of the story to police, to family, to people who were trying to help, but those were explanations. This is different. This is the first time I'm saying what actually happened without adjusting it to make sense to someone else. We were 4 friends. We'd known each other since college. Nothing unusual, no dark pasts, no strange obsessions. Just 4 guys who'd stayed in touch longer than most people do. The trip wasn't spontaneous. We planned it for months. It was Mark's idea originally. He wanted to get away from work, unplug for a few days, do something that reminded him of being younger. Mark always talked about needing to reset. He worked in finance, lived in a city apartment, and was always complaining about noise, notifications, other people. Josh was the outdoors guy. He'd done real camping before. Not Instagram camping, actual backcountry stuff. When Mark suggested it, Josh immediately started listing places we could go that were far enough out to be quiet but still reachable in a day's drive. Evan and I were somewhere in the middle, not against it, not overly excited. But we trusted Josh, and we liked the idea of being off-grid for a few days. The place we chose was a state-managed wilderness area in the northern part of the state. No established campsites, no reservation system. You were allowed to camp as long as you stayed within certain boundaries and followed the posted rules. Josh said that was ideal, less people. We drove up early on a Thursday morning, 2 cars. Evan rode with me, Mark drove with Josh. Cell service faded about an hour before we reached the trailhead. By the time we parked, our phones were basically bricks. The trailhead was empty. That should have stood out to me more than it did. There was a small wooden sign posted near the start of the trail. It listed standard information, fire restrictions, wildlife warnings, leave no trace. At the bottom, in smaller lettering, there was a line that said, "Campers are advised to remain within designated zones after dark." Josh said that was probably just legal language. We hiked for about 2 hours before Josh picked a spot. It was near a creek with enough flat ground for tents and a natural clearing that let in light. The trees around us were tall and dense, but not oppressive. At least not during the day. We set up camp, cooked dinner, talked, drank a little. Everything felt normal. That's important to understand. Nothing felt wrong at first. The first night I woke up because I thought I heard someone walking around the tents. Not footsteps exactly, more like careful movement, leaves shifting, a pause, then more movement. I assumed it was Josh. I called his name quietly. No answer. I unzipped my tent just enough to look out. The clearing was empty. The fire pit was cold. The creek made its usual sound. The trees stood still. I remember thinking it was strange that I hadn't heard any animals. No insects, no distant sounds, just the creek. I went back to sleep. The next morning, Evan asked if anyone had been up during the night. Josh and Mark both said no. We didn't push it. That was the first time something happened that none of us could fully explain. It wasn't the last. The second day started normally enough that we all pretended the night before hadn't happened. Josh made coffee using a small camp stove. Mark complained about sleeping on the ground. Evan wandered down to the creek to wash his face. If there was an unspoken agreement not to talk about the sounds I'd heard, it didn't feel forced. It felt natural, like avoiding a topic you don't want to give weight to. Josh pulled out a map while we were eating breakfast. It was a laminated topographical map he'd printed before the trip, marked with our route in pen. He said he wanted to do a short hike farther north that day, maybe find a higher elevation for views. That was when Evan pointed something out. According to the map, the creek we were camped near wasn't marked. At first, Josh brushed it off. Maps weren't always perfectly updated, especially in areas like this. Seasonal water sources came and went, but Evan wasn't talking about the creek itself. He was talking about the clearing. The map showed dense tree coverage where we were sitting. No break in the canopy, no flat open space. Josh frowned and checked his GPS unit. It still worked without cell service using satellite. Our coordinates were correct. We were where we thought we were, but the map didn't show the clearing. Josh said maybe the clearing was man-made, old logging activity or controlled burns. That explanation satisfied Mark and Evan. It didn't satisfy me, but I didn't have a better one. We packed light and headed north. The forest changed gradually as we walked. The ground became softer. The air felt heavier. The trees grew closer together, their branches overlapping overhead. It wasn't dark, but the light thinned out. About 40 minutes into the hike, we found something that didn't belong. A wooden post. It was old, weathered gray, about chest high, with no sign attached. Just a post driven into the ground. Josh circled it slowly, scanning for others. There were more, not in a line, not marking a trail. They were spaced irregularly, like someone had placed them to suggest a boundary without clearly defining one. Josh said they might be old property markers. Evan joked that we'd crossed into someone's private forest. Mark didn't laugh. He said the woods felt wrong. That was the first time one of us said something like that out loud. We stopped not long after. None of us could agree on why. We just didn't want to keep going in that direction. Josh didn't argue. He folded the map and said we'd head back. On the way back, I noticed something else. There were no animal tracks, no deer paths, no disturbed underbrush. It was like nothing moved through that area except us. When we got back to camp, things felt slightly off. Not dramatically, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Our tents were exactly as we'd left them, but the fire pit had been disturbed. The stones had shifted, not knocked over, just adjusted, like someone had nudged them into a tighter circle. Josh said maybe the ground settled. I didn't argue. That afternoon, Mark went quiet. He sat on a log near the edge of the clearing and just watched the trees. Evan tried to pull him into conversation, but Mark kept losing his train of thought. At one point, he asked what time it was. Josh told him. 10 minutes later, Mark asked again. That night, we decided to keep the fire going longer than planned. Not because we were scared, at least not consciously. It just felt better to have light. We sat around talking about anything except the woods, old stories, college stuff, jobs, relationships. We laughed more than usual, like we were trying to prove something. Around midnight, the forest went quiet. I don't mean normal nighttime quiet. I mean the kind where you suddenly realize how much sound was there before. The creek was still there. But everything else stopped. Josh noticed it too. He stopped mid-sentence. We all listened. That's when we heard it. Footsteps, not running, not heavy, slow, deliberate steps coming from beyond the edge of the clearing. Josh stood up and shined his flashlight toward the sound. The beam caught tree trunks, low branches, nothing else. The footsteps stopped. Josh called out, just a simple, "Hey." No response. He waited a few seconds, then said it was probably another camper, maybe someone else hiking late. Mark asked why they wouldn't answer. Josh didn't have a good response. We didn't sleep much that night. Sometime before dawn, I woke up again. This time I knew what had woken me. Someone was standing just outside my tent. I could see their shadow through the fabric. It was tall. Still, I held my breath. The shadow didn't move. After what felt like a long time, it slowly receded. The next morning, there were footprints around the edge of the clearing, barefoot. They didn't come closer than the fire pit. Josh stared at them for a long time without saying anything. Then he folded the map and said we were leaving. The decision to leave should have ended everything. That's what I believed at the time. That once Josh said it out loud, once we agreed, the tension would break and the rest would be nothing more than a stressful story we'd laugh about later. We packed quickly, faster than we had set up, no one arguing over gear placement or double-checking lists. The clearing felt different in the morning light. Smaller somehow, less neutral. Mark didn't help much. He kept stopping, staring at the tree line like he was trying to recognize something. Josh had to tell him twice to grab his pack. We took the same trail we'd come in on, or at least we thought we did. At first, everything lined up. The creek ran alongside us. The terrain felt familiar. But after about 20 minutes, Josh slowed down. He checked the GPS again, then the map. He stopped completely. We were walking south. The trail sloped slightly downhill. That hadn't happened on the way in. Josh turned around, walked a short distance back, then returned to us with a look I hadn't seen on his face before. Not fear. Confusion edged with something like professional embarrassment. He said the trail wasn't matching the map anymore. Evan asked what that meant. Josh said either the map was wrong or we weren't on the same trail. Mark laughed, sharp and sudden. It sounded forced. He said maybe the woods didn't want us to leave. No one responded. Josh suggested we stop and reassess. We marked a tree, tied a strip of orange tape around it, and continued for another 10 minutes. The terrain began to feel familiar again, too familiar. We came back to the clearing, not exactly. It wasn't the same clearing, but it was close enough that my stomach dropped. The same spacing between trees, the same slope. A fire pit already there, stones arranged in a neat circle, but our tents weren't there. Neither were the packs we'd been carrying moments earlier. Josh didn't say anything for a long time. Evan swore. Mark sat down hard on the ground and stared at the fire pit. Josh finally spoke. He said we needed to stay calm. That losing orientation in dense forest wasn't unheard of. That panic made people make mistakes. He suggested we stay put for a few hours, let things settle, then try again. That's when Mark stood up. He said he knew where we were. Josh asked what he meant. Mark said this place had rules. He said it casually, like he was stating something obvious. Josh asked him what rules. Mark looked at him and said, "You're not supposed to walk out." We all stared at him. Mark rubbed his face with both hands and said he'd been remembering things, not clearly, more like impressions, the way you remember a dream after it's already slipping away. He said his grandfather used to tell him stories about this forest, about places that weren't meant to be passed through, about areas that looked empty but weren't. Josh asked why he'd never mentioned that before. Mark said because it sounded stupid, because he hadn't believed it, because he didn't think it was relevant. He said people who came here didn't leave the same way they arrived. Evan asked him to stop. Mark didn't. He said the posts we'd seen weren't property markers, they were reminders. Josh told him to shut up. Mark looked at me then, directly at me, and asked if I'd noticed how quiet it was. I had. The forest wasn't silent, but it wasn't alive either. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through leaves, just a static presence like a held breath. That afternoon, Evan went missing. It happened quickly. He stepped away from the clearing to relieve himself. He was gone less than a minute. Josh called his name, no answer. We searched the immediate area, shouting, flashlights, nothing, no footprints, no sound, just absence. Mark said we weren't supposed to split up. Josh grabbed him by the collar and shoved him back. He yelled that this wasn't helping, that Evan was probably disoriented and would come back, but he didn't. As evening fell, Mark grew calmer, too calm. He said Evan had crossed a boundary, that he hadn't meant to, but it didn't matter. Josh demanded to know how Mark knew all this. Mark said he wasn't sure anymore where the knowledge was coming from, only that it felt old, familiar, like something he'd always known and forgotten on purpose. That night the footsteps returned. This time they circled the clearing, slow, evenly spaced, never rushing. Josh kept the fire going all night. His hands shook when he fed it. Every time he shined his flashlight into the trees, the beam reflected off nothing. Mark sat near the fire and whispered to himself, "I didn't sleep." Just before dawn, Mark stood up and walked into the trees. Josh yelled after him. Mark didn't turn around. He didn't run. He didn't hesitate. He walked like someone heading home. Josh went after him. I tried to follow, but Josh told me to stay put. He said one of us needed to be visible. I listened. That was the last time I saw either of them. By morning, I was alone. The clearing was gone. I was sitting in a forest that looked untouched. No fire pit, no markers, no signs we had ever been there, except for my pack and the footprints leading away from it. Barefoot. I followed the footprints because they were the only thing that made sense. They weren't fresh in the way mud tracks are fresh. There was no displaced soil, no broken leaves. They looked more like impressions pressed into the forest floor after the fact, as if the ground itself had decided to remember them. Bare feet, adult size, too evenly spaced. I kept telling myself they were marks. That explanation was easier than the alternatives. I walked slowly, counting steps without realizing I was doing it. Every few minutes I stopped and listened. The forest still felt wrong, not empty, more like uninterested, as if I was moving through something that didn't require sound anymore. After maybe 20 minutes, the footprints ended, not faded, not scattered. They just stopped. I stood there for a long time, staring at the last impression. Toes pressed cleanly into dirt, no sign of turning around, no sign of struggle, just an ending. That was when I noticed the path. It hadn't been there before. I was sure of it. A narrow trail, barely wide enough for one person, winding forward between the trees. It wasn't worn like a hiking trail. It looked intentional, maintained, cleared just enough to guide someone without advertising itself. I didn't want to follow it, but I also couldn't go back. When I turned around, the forest behind me didn't look like the forest I'd walked through. The spacing between trees was different. The light came from the wrong angle. I stepped onto the path. As I walked, I started noticing things that didn't belong. A rusted metal signpost with no sign attached. A concrete foundation half swallowed by moss. Old nails embedded in tree trunks at shoulder height, spaced at regular intervals. Someone had been here, not recently, but deliberately. After a while, the path opened into a clearing, smaller than the first one, more enclosed. In the center stood a structure that made my chest tighten before I fully understood what I was seeing. It was a building. Not a cabin, not a shed. A house, old, wooden, 2 stories, though the upper level sagged slightly. The paint was long gone, leaving gray exposed boards. The windows were dark, intact, but opaque with age. I knew that house. I had never seen it before in my life, but I knew it. The recognition hit the way certain smells do, sudden, emotional, uninvited. My heart started racing and my hands went numb. I felt like I was standing in front of something I had been avoiding remembering. I walked closer. The front door was open. Inside, the air was colder. Still, dust coated every surface undisturbed. No footprints, no signs of recent use, yet nothing felt abandoned. On a table near the entrance lay a notebook. I picked it up. The cover was cracked leather, no title, no name. The first page was dated. June 14, 1989. The handwriting was careful, formal, not a diary style, more like documentation. The entries described meetings, decisions, votes. They described the forest. They described a community, a town that had existed here briefly, established, populated, then dissolved. The language used wasn't emotional, it was administrative, as if erasing a place was just another logistical task. There were references to containment, non-reintegration, and memory drift. One entry mentioned an incident involving 4 men entering the forest without authorization. 3 were absorbed. 1 was returned. I sat down on the floor. The returned subject was described as disoriented but compliant. Memory suppression was noted as successful but incomplete. I flipped ahead, hands shaking. There was a name, mine spelled correctly, dated 22 years ago. I didn't remember being here, but my body did. The final entries were brief. The town was closed. The house was left as an anchor point. The forest was to remain unmarked. The area self-corrects, the last line read. Further intervention unnecessary. I don't remember how I left the house. I remember standing at the edge of the trees and seeing the road, the real road, asphalt, faded yellow lines. My car parked exactly where I'd left it. I remember a ranger finding me hours later. He asked where my friends were. I told him the truth. He wrote something down and nodded. The official report said they were lost hikers. Search and rescue lasted 3 days. They found nothing. I went home. I tried to resume my life. I stopped hiking. I avoided forests altogether. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I see that clearing again. Not the one with the tents, the other one with the house. Waiting, because places like that don't disappear. They just wait for someone who already belongs to them to come back.